She buried her husband with empty arms and a heart full of silence. For 20 years, that silence was the only thing that grew on her barren land. Then one morning, the silence was broken. 15 children stood at her gate, cold, starving, and calling her ma'am. This is the story of what happened next. But I have to warn you, this isn't just a story about a lonely woman and a group of orphans. This is a story about secrets buried deeper than any grave, and a love so fierce it would burn the world down to keep its promises. The first knock didn't come with fists. It was a soft, timid rattle of wood against aging iron, like a sound made by someone too weak to know how hard to ask for help. Ada Quinn lifted her head from the stove. The flame inside struggled, a low and quiet thing, embers just barely biting at the dry kindling she'd fed it an hour ago. She wasn't expecting anyone. In 20 years, no one ever came this far out. The road had forgotten her. The world had forgotten her. That's how she liked it. Outside, the wind rolled like an empty wagon over an ocean of sand. Dust scuffed the edge of the windowsill, and the chimney spat nothing but dry air. Smoke was a luxury she couldn't afford today. Still, Ada reached for her shawl, the frayed wool a familiar comfort, tucking the edge beneath her elbow as she crossed the cabin floor. Her knees cracked. The sound was louder than the knock had been. She paused at the door, her hand hovering over the latch. A lifetime of solitude had taught her that an unopened door was a safe door. But something, a flicker of a feeling she hadn't felt since her husband Jacob drew his last breath, pushed her forward. She pulled the heavy door inward, and what she saw on her porch made the air vanish from her lungs. 15 of them. A crooked line of children, ranging from a toddler barely able to stand to a boy who might have been 16. They were ghosts, made of dust and bone. Some clutched one another for warmth, for courage. Some stared at their worn-out boots, too ashamed to look up. Some were just dazed, their eyes hollow from the sun, and a hunger that went deeper than food. The oldest, a boy with a split lip and one eye swollen completely shut, took a shaky step forward. In his arms, he held a bundle wrapped in a filthy blanket. A baby. "Ma'am," he said, his voice as dry and cracked as the riverbed a mile south. "We ain't thieves. We just need somewhere to sit for a while." Ada didn't speak. She couldn't. Her voice was a rusted thing, buried under 2 decades of grief. She just counted them again. 15. All of them filthy, one barefoot in the cold morning air, one holding a crying toddler that clearly wasn't her own. The boy with the swollen eye, he held the baby out a little further, a desperate, silent plea. Ada had no words. Just a strange, hollow ache rising up from a place beneath her ribs she thought had turned to stone long ago. A place she thought had stopped hoping. Then the smallest child, a little girl no bigger than Ada's porch stool, with hair the color of straw and eyes far too old for her face, took one tiny step forward. She looked right at Ada, right into the fortress she'd built around her heart, and she whispered a single word: "Please." It was the word that broke the dam. Ada stepped aside. They didn't rush in like a flood. They moved like spirits, quiet and careful, their feet barely whispering on the floorboards. They seemed to believe they could be turned away at any second, that this small kindness was a dream they might wake from. The oldest boy, whose name she would later learn was Levi, carried the littlest one in his arms. 3 other boys half-carried an older girl who couldn't walk on her own, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Ada just stood in the doorway, a silent statue, as the vast, heavy silence of the desert rushed in to fill the space they'd left behind. It felt thicker now, heavier. She hadn't spoken a full sentence in almost a year, not since the last letter from the township informed her the train wouldn't be coming through anymore. Not since the doctor had been found out by the canyon pass, his horse gone, his bag empty. She hadn't seen another living soul since the peddler traded salt for lamp oil 2 summers back. And she hadn't truly thought of children, not really, since the day they buried Jacob on the red clay hill behind the house. The preacher had placed a hand on her shoulder that day, his words meant to comfort. God's will, he'd said, sometimes comes with empty cradles. But now her cradle was full, her house was full, her life, which had been as empty as the sky, was suddenly, impossibly full. 15 of them. Sinking onto the floorboards, onto the chairs, onto every scrap of blanket she could pull from the old cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Something inside her broke free. She moved like a woman possessed. Water went on the stove. Flour was scraped from the very bottom of the barrel. A tin of beans she'd been saving for the dead of winter was opened without a second thought. The cabin, once a tomb of memories, was suddenly alive with the clatter of tin plates and the hiss of boiling water. Not one of the children spoke a word while they ate. They just ate, their hands shaking, their eyes wide. But they watched her. Every move she made, their eyes tracked her, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle, as if they were trying to guess what she might do next, trying to figure out if they'd be told to leave the second the food was gone. Finally, Ada cleared her throat. Her voice came out rough, a stranger to her own ears. "Where are you from?" A long pause hung in the air. The only sound was the scrape of a spoon against a tin plate. Then Levi, the oldest boy, spoke. His voice was low, defeated. "West," he said, "but there ain't nothing west anymore." Another child, a girl with fiery red hair and a face full of freckles, added, "Our wagon caught fire." A third, a small boy huddled in the corner, whispered, "We've been walking since the river dried up." Simple answers. Too simple. No one said whose children they were. No one mentioned parents. Ada looked at their faces, at the fear they tried so hard to hide. She knew there was more to the story, but she also knew that some questions were too heavy to ask. She didn't ask again. By nightfall, the wind picked up its mournful song, humming a lonely tune against the window panes. Ada lit every lantern she owned, filling the small cabin with a warm, flickering glow. The children, now bathed and wrapped in every stitch of linen and wool she possessed, lay scattered like fallen stars across her floor. Their breathing filled the silence that had suffocated her for so long. Ada stood in the doorway, watching them sleep, and for the first time in 20 years, she cried. It wasn't a loud cry, not a storm of grief like the one that had drowned her when Jacob died. It was a quiet leak, a few silent tears that traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. Just enough, just long enough to remember what silence used to feel like before it had turned into a monster named grief. The next morning, the sun came up pale and still, shimmering over the hills like tired gold. For 20 years, Ada had begun her days alone. Her routine was a ritual of solitude, the stove, the rocker, and the sight of Jacob's grave in the distance. But now, her porch held a different kind of weight. The weight of small footsteps, the weight of quiet whispers, the weight of life. And deep in her chest, something moved. A feeling she hadn't dared to name in decades. It felt like a beginning. It wasn't one she had asked for. It wasn't one she would have believed possible even yesterday. But it was here. Something in the universe had shifted on its axis. She looked out at the scrubland, as barren and unforgiving as ever, and said aloud, her voice carrying on the wind, "Guess we'll need more bread." Inside, a new world was being born. Levi was trying to boil water over the fire, his brow furrowed in concentration. The girl with the limp was carefully folding blankets. A young boy sat on the floor, drawing intricate shapes in the dust with a twig. Another child, a girl named Mabel, was braiding Ada's worn curtain tassels, her small fingers moving as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And in that house, under that roof, where silence had once slept like a second ghost in every dark corner, there was a new sound. Laughter. It wasn't loud. It was fragile, tentative. But it was enough. It was more than enough. By the end of that first week, Ada Quinn had learned all 15 names. She wrote them down in a dusty ledger Jacob once used for cattle counts, printing each letter with slow, deliberate care so she wouldn't forget a single one. Levi was the oldest, barely 16, a boy too thin to cast much of a shadow and too worn down to remember what safety felt like. He was the protector, the one they all looked to. Then came Elsie, the girl with the bad leg. She'd once walked upright, Levi said, before her ankle had been shattered by a runaway ox cart, or so he claimed. Elsie rarely spoke, but her hands were never still. She helped, always. Her fingers were quick and steady, and she sewed like she'd been born with a needle in her palm, mending clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. The rest of them came in tides, clinging to each other in pairs or threes. They were a constellation of lost souls. There were Peter and Ruth, twins with big brown eyes, who communicated in a secret language of shrugs and smirks. There was Lyle, a quiet boy who never stopped watching the horizon, as if he was expecting someone to come for them. Mabel, who sang soft, sad songs under her breath and braided everyone's hair in the same crooked, loving way. And there was Jack, a sweet-natured boy who was slow to move and even slower to speak, but who clung to Ada's hip the way she imagined a child might cling to their real mother. Each night, they made pallets out of old flour sacks and blankets. The cabin, which had once seemed so wide and echoing, a space built for a family that never came, was now bustling like a church before Sunday service. The floorboards creaked with constant motion. The doors stayed open to let in the breeze. Laughter came in small, tentative bursts at first, then grew bolder, stronger. The silence was still there, lurking in the corners, but it wasn't so heavy anymore. It had to make room for life. Levi never explained where the rest of the adults had gone. He never spoke of who the children truly belonged to. His story about the wagon fire felt thin, worn through like an old blanket. Every night, he would find Ada, thank her in a voice that was quiet and gruff, like a man 50 years older than his bones, and then he would make sure the younger ones were settled and not causing trouble. Ada didn't press him for more. She had learned through long, hard winters and dry, unforgiving years that some truths didn't need prying. If they wanted to speak, they would. If not, she would still feed them. She would still keep them safe. But one night, long after the others had drifted off to sleep, their soft breaths filling the cabin, Levi came to her on the porch. He stood with his arms crossed over his thin chest, his silhouette stark against the starlit sky. His voice was thin, laced with a fear he could no longer hide. "I think they mean to come looking for us," he said. Ada stopped her rocking chair. The gentle creak fell silent. "Who?" "The ones that sold us." A cold dread settled in Ada's stomach, heavy as a stone. Levi's story finally began to unravel. Not all the grown-ups died when the wagon burned, he confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. Some ran off, some just stayed behind, but a few of them, his jaw clenched, and the muscles in his young face went tight. They wanted to sell the little ones. Some of them already were being sold. "And you?" Ada asked, her voice barely audible. Levi looked down at his feet, a wave of shame washing over him, shame for something he should have been proud of. "I waited until they weren't looking. I took 'em. All the ones I could." He finally looked up, his one good eye meeting hers in the dark. "Figured we'd just keep going, keep walking until someone finally said stop." Ada rose from her rocker. She went to the stove, poured 2 tin cups of weak leftover tea, and handed one to him. Her weathered hand brushed against his. "Well," she said softly, her voice full of a strength he hadn't heard before, "you made it to stop." He looked up at her, and for the first time, the hardness in his eyes seemed to soften. For just a moment he looked like a boy again, not a weary soldier. They didn't speak more that night. The silence between them was filled with a new understanding, a shared secret. But when Ada finally went inside and turned the lantern low, she did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She took Jacob's old rifle from its hooks above the mantelpiece, checked its mechanism with a practiced hand, and placed it by the door. Just in case. That winter came hard and early, as if the heavens themselves were angry. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, and the wind howled like a half-alive beast across the plains. Ada had never shared the big bed she and Jacob had built together. It was a sacred space, a shrine to a ghost. But one night, when the temperature dipped far below freezing and the youngest, a little girl named Emmy, couldn't stop shaking from the cold, Ada made a decision. She pulled the trembling child into bed with her, under the heavy quilt. Then she looked at the others, huddled on the floor. "Pile in," she commanded softly. "All of you." By morning, she was blanketed in a different kind of warmth. Dozens of small limbs were tangled around her like ivy, their collective heat a shield against the biting cold. And for the first time in 2 decades, she woke to the sound of breathing that was not her own. It wasn't easy. There were struggles that winter that tested them all. The roof sprang a leak during the second big storm, and they had to huddle in one corner of the cabin with buckets catching the steady drip, drip, drip of icy water. One of the boys, Reuben, came down with a raging fever that nearly took him. Their food supply ran low, not out, but close, dangerously close. Still, through it all, none of them ran, and Ida never once thought of sending them away. The snow eventually turned to mud, and the mud, blessed be, turned to grass. By spring, they had learned to grow things again. It was a miracle. Mabel, the girl who hummed sad songs, seemed to have a magic touch. She coaxed life out of the stubborn, dry earth in the garden. Peter and Ruth, the silent twins, dug a trench for runoff with a focus that was almost frightening. Levi and Lyle patched the old barn roof using fence wood that was nearly rotten, but they made it work. Ada watched it all unfold, a strange weight settling in her chest. She couldn't name the feeling. It was pride, maybe, or fear, or maybe it was both, tangled together like the roots of the stubborn weeds in her garden. Then one night, as the stars blinked wide and bright above them, and the air held the sweet, clean scent of new growth, a man rode up the trail. He didn't knock. He just dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man who knew exactly where he was and wasn't surprised to see the house lit up and full of life. Ada stood on the porch, her hand resting near the doorframe. Levi stood beside her, a silent shadow. The man tipped his hat, his face lost in the twilight. "Evening," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge like a whetstone. Ada's voice was firm, solid as a rock. "You're lost." "No, ma'am." He looked past her, his gaze fixing on the window where the face of one of the smaller children blinked back at him before disappearing. "I believe you've got something of mine." Ada didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "I've got 15 someones," she said, her voice dangerously low. "And not a one of them belongs to anyone but the Lord now." The man's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "I was told they were here." "Then you were told wrong." She placed her hand lightly on the doorframe, a silent signal to Levi. "Now, unless you're offering help or food, I suggest you be on your way." He didn't move. He just stared at her, his eyes cold and assessing. Then his gaze shifted to Levi. A cruel smile touched his lips. "I remember you," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You pulled a knife on me in the canyon. Took a girl right off my wagon." Levi didn't speak. He just stood taller. The man took a deliberate step forward, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. That was all it took. Ada reached inside the door. Her fingers found the cold iron of Jacob's rifle. She pulled it from its hook, leveling it low but steady, the barrel aimed right at the man's heart. "You take one more step," she said, her voice as cold and deadly as the steel in her hands, "and I'll bury you next to the fence post." He froze. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet widow in the middle of nowhere was gone. In her place stood something else entirely, something fierce. He smiled, but it was a sharp, cruel thing. "You think they're safe here with you?" "No," Ada said plainly, "but they're not afraid anymore, and that's worth something." He tipped his hat again, but this time it was a mockery. "You've made yourself a nest of trouble, old woman, and I don't imagine it'll end quiet." Then he mounted his horse and rode back into the darkness from which he came. Ada didn't lower the rifle for a long, long time. Behind her, Levi let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. "That was him," he whispered. Ada nodded, her eyes still scanning the dark horizon. "I know. You think he'll come back?" Another long pause. Ada finally lowered the rifle. A grim, determined look settled on her face. "I hope he does," she said. That night, she didn't sleep. Not because of fear. She was long past fear. She didn't sleep because of purpose. She hadn't had a purpose in so long. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Now, it beat steady and strong inside her, like a war drum calling her to battle. She had children to protect. She had a life worth keeping, and heaven help anyone who tried to take it from her. The morning came with no sound but the wind in the chimney and the quiet tapping of spoons against tin bowls. The children ate without speaking, their young faces serious. They could sense the air had changed, that the fragile peace of their sanctuary had been shattered, though few of them understood why. Ada moved through her morning rituals as usual, measured steps, soft words, but her eyes were different. They were sharper, constantly flicking to the door, to the windows, to the empty horizon. She had checked the latch on the door 3 times before dawn, and had moved Jacob's rifle from the wall to the hearth, where it leaned like a silent guardian. She cleaned it while pretending to polish the kettle, her hands moving with an old, familiar skill. Levi saw. He didn't say a word, but when he went out to chop wood that morning, he didn't just stack it by the door. He stacked it high against the windows on the north side of the cabin, creating a crude but effective barricade, just in case. By the second week, they had all felt the shift. A silent drill had begun. They learned to keep their shoes near their bedrolls at night. They learned to keep the door bolted, even when the sun sat high and friendly in the sky. Ada started walking the perimeter of the cabin every evening, a quiet, solitary patrol that no one asked about. She would come back inside with wind-chapped cheeks, a folded map she'd found in Jacob's trunk tucked in her apron pocket, and a fire in her eyes that hadn't burned this hot since the day she'd buried her husband beneath the stone cross by the sycamore. The fear began to creep back into the children. Peter and Ruth, the twins, grew quiet again, their secret language of smirks replaced by one of worried glances. Elsie moved faster, her limp more pronounced, a nervous energy propelling her. Even Mabel, the singer of sad songs, stopped humming. But Ada didn't waver. She gathered them close and taught them to keep going, even when fear set in. Especially then. By mid-March, their little cabin began to look less like a refuge and more like a fortress. Wooden planks, scavenged from the collapsed barn, sealed the cracks in the siding. The window slats were reinforced, and behind the barn, Levi had dug 2 long, deep trenches. For water runoff, he'd said, but everyone knew the truth. They were trenches where water might flow, or where people might fall if things got bad. "Ada," Mabel asked one day, her voice small as she sat cross-legged near the root cellar where they stored the last of the winter carrots. "Are we in trouble?" Ada looked up from her planting, her hands caked in dirt. She looked at the small, worried face and felt a surge of fierce love. "No, darling," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We're in a world that's made for wolves, but we've got too many hearts to feed to be afraid of teeth." Mabel didn't quite understand what she meant, but she smiled anyway and went back to tying up the new bean vines. And then the letters came. The first one arrived in a neat, clean envelope, carried by a nervous courier boy on a fast bay horse. He'd ridden up smiling, but his smile vanished when he saw the rifle leaning against the porch. He handed the note over with shaking fingers, turned his horse, and galloped away without a word. The message inside was short, typewritten, and signed with a seal of red wax. The words were a cold blade. "Return what you have taken, or more will be taken from you. You have until the next full moon." Ada read it aloud to Levi, her voice betraying no emotion. Then, she calmly walked to the stove, lifted the lid, and dropped the letter into the flames. She watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash. Levi stood by the window, his young face a mask of grim determination. He said nothing, but that night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with Jacob's rifle in his lap and watched the stars pass by, one by one. 3 days later, another message came. This one wasn't delivered. It was nailed to the barn door. Ada found it in the morning, the wood splintered around a single cruel nail. A smear of blood, dark and dry, stained the bottom edge. Whether it was the blood of a man or a beast, she couldn't tell. This letter carried no words, just a single crude line drawing, a cabin, unmistakably hers, surrounded by licking flames. She didn't show this one to the children. She just tore it down, her movements sharp and angry, and buried it beneath the old ash tree at the edge of the property. But she didn't sleep that night either. Inside the cabin, the dread was a palpable thing. The youngest children began to pick up on it, like animals sensing an earthquake. Emmy started wetting her bed again. Jack, the sweet, slow-moving boy, refused to speak for 3 days straight. Even Levi, as hardened as he was by a life Ada could barely imagine, flinched now when the wind pushed too hard on the shutters. But Ada Quinn did not allow fear to dictate her steps. Every day, she cleaned, she baked, she planted, and she taught. She taught them to write their names, to chop wood properly, to hammer a nail straight. And she taught them how to defend themselves. She taught them how to take care of each other. "You can't always wait for someone else to protect you," she said one morning, her voice steely, as she showed a wide-eyed Lyle how to sharpen a blade. "Sometimes, you have to be the person you wish would show up." And then, one night, just a few days before the full moon was set to rise, Elsie came running from the well, her face pale with terror, her bad leg forgotten. "Riders!" she gasped, stumbling onto the porch. "3 of them! Heading this way, fast!" Ada moved with a speed that defied her age. There was no panic, only a chilling, focused calm. "Levi, the barn! Mabel, take the littles to the root cellar now! Peter, Ruth, boards for the window, now!" Her orders were sharp, clipped, leaving no room for argument or fear, no shouting, no panic, just a flurry of practiced, desperate action. She handed Levi the rifle, her eyes locking with his for a brief, understanding moment. She took up Jacob's old double-barreled shotgun herself. She closed the heavy wooden shutters, latched the reinforced door, and then they waited. The world went silent. The hoofbeats came slow and deliberate, the sound echoing in the unnerving quiet. They knew they were being listened to. They were enjoying it. Ada peeked through a thin slat in the door, just as the first rider appeared in the moonlight. He was dressed all in black, his face half covered by a scarf, his eyes as cold as stone. He dismounted, knocked once on the porch beam with the butt of his pistol, and then waited. Ada didn't open the door. He knocked again, harder this time. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice smooth and mocking. "I know you're in there. I know what you're keeping." Ada didn't move a muscle. "I ain't here to hurt children," the man continued, his voice taking on a falsely reasonable tone. "But I was paid a lot of money to bring 'em back. Simple as that." Still, nothing but silence from inside the cabin. "You open this door," he said, the politeness gone, replaced by a raw threat. "And we talk. You don't. And this is going to get noisy." Inside, Levi gripped the rifle so hard his knuckles had turned white. In the root cellar, Jack whimpered, and Emmy buried her face in Mabel's lap. Ada lowered her eyes for one single heartbeat, took a deep breath, and then stood up straight. "Lyle," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute command. "The back hatch. Go to the creek. Follow it east. Don't you stop running until the sun rises." Lyle hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "But now," she ordered. The boy scrambled to obey. The moment the back hatch clicked shut, the man on the porch seemed to hear it. His head snapped up. He stepped back off the porch and barked a single sharp word to his companions. "Go!" The explosion of noise was instantaneous. Wood splintered, a window smashed in, boots pounded across the hard-packed dirt. Gunfire erupted from the back of the cabin, where Levi had already repositioned himself. He shot once, twice. There was a scream of pain from the darkness. He'd hit someone. Ada braced herself as the front door buckled, the wood groaning and cracking under a heavy assault. Then, just as suddenly, it went silent again. A heavy, terrifying silence. She stepped forward, the big shotgun raised, her finger on the trigger, and she stopped dead. The man from the porch stood inside her shattered doorway. He was bleeding from a wound on his arm, but his eyes were filled with a burning, triumphant fury. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a second man, and he was holding Elsie by the arm, her face a mask of terror. "She was at the well," the first man growled, a wicked smirk spreading across his face. Ada's face changed. The calm mask shattered, replaced by a blaze of pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes burned. The man smirked, sensing his victory. "Still want to pretend this is your fight, old woman?" Elsie didn't cry. She didn't even tremble. She looked straight at Ada, her eyes as calm as a sunrise, and her voice, though small, rang out with impossible courage. "It's mine, too." That was all Ada needed to hear. She fired the shotgun. The roar filled the small cabin, followed by smoke and screams and chaos. It was a whirlwind of violence, guns and fists and broken glass. But through it all, Ada Quinn did not fall. She fought. She fought like a cornered lioness. She fought like someone who had waited her entire life to defend something worth bleeding for. When the last echo of the final shot faded into the night, 3 men lay still in the dust of her yard. Levi stood over one of them, his chest heaving, his face pale but resolute. Ada knelt beside Elsie, her hands gently checking the girl's pulse. It was still strong, still steady. The cabin was bruised and broken, the wood splintered and scarred, but it was still standing. Just like all of them. No one had died that night, but no one would ever forget it. The next day they buried 2 men out by the sycamore tree, not far from Jacob's grave. The third man, the one Levi had shot in the dark, had managed to crawl off into the night. They didn't chase him, they didn't need to. Let him go. Let him carry the message. Let the wolves of the world whisper their stories. There was something sacred on this land now, and it would not be taken, not without a fight to the death.
The cabin stood battered, but it was not broken. The shutters were cracked. The porch was torn up by bullet holes and the scrapes of heavy boots, and the front door hung crookedly on a single hinge, but it held. And inside, so did they. Mabel's hands trembled as she stitched up the gash on Levi's shoulder. The bullet had only grazed him, a final, desperate shot from the third man as he'd fled into the darkness, but it was deep enough to bleed. Levi didn't flinch. He just kept his eyes on the other children, his face a grim mask, while Ada sat with Elsie, gently brushing dust and dried blood from the girl's pale cheeks. No one asked if the men would come back. They all knew the answer. They would. But for now, for this one fragile moment, the world was quiet. And that was enough. Levi spent the next day turning their home into a fortress. He and Peter took what was left of the barn's planks and nailed them over the windows, double thickness this time. Ruth, her arm bruised from shoulder to elbow, helped Ada boil down pine resin, layering the sticky, fragrant goo between the boards to seal out the wind, the sound, and any prying eyes. Mabel kept the younger ones close, a protective hen with her frightened chicks, never letting Emmy or Jack wander out of her arm's reach. The root cellar, once just a place for storing food, had transformed. It was now a sanctuary, a last resort. Blankets lined the damp earthen walls. Candles and matches were stored in a waterproof tin. The water barrels were kept topped off. And still, Ada moved like a woman chasing time, her every action fueled by a grim, silent urgency. She knew they hadn't bought safety, only a brief reprieve. Every hour after sunset she paced the perimeter, a silent guardian angel armed with a shotgun. One night Peter followed her. She didn't say anything when she saw his small shadow trailing hers. She just handed him her spare lantern and kept walking. He matched her steps, stride for stride, until they had circled the cabin twice. They stopped by the well, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears. "I'm not scared," Peter said finally, his voice small but determined. Ada looked at him, at his young, serious face illuminated by the lantern light. "You should be," she said softly. "I'm not scared for me," he clarified, looking up at her with his big, dark eyes. "I'm scared for you." Something in Ada's hardened heart softened, just a little. "I've buried more than most boys your age have even known," she said, her voice rough with memory. "But I've never fought for something like this, not before you all came." He nodded, a solemn, grown-up gesture. "Then we fight together." And they did. The children, once just a huddled mass of fear, began to train. They worked in pairs. Mabel showed Jack how to carry water from the well in complete silence. Ruth taught Emmy which herbs to wrap for fevers, and which ones could be used to dull pain. Levi, his shoulder now healing, sharpened nails and tied them to planks, creating crude but vicious traps to set beneath the porch. Ada, meanwhile, built a second hidden hatch, this one beneath the stone hearth. It was barely wide enough for two of the smallest children to crawl through, leading to a narrow tunnel that ended in the thick brush behind the cabin. It was a desperate measure, but it might just matter. But it wasn't all grim preparation. There were moments of light that shimmered between the long shadows of worry. Moments that reminded them all what they were fighting for. Like when Elsie, her voice finally returning, sat on the cabin floor and sang to Emmy, soft, wordless tunes that sounded older than the desert itself. Or when Peter taught Ruth how to carve her name into a piece of wood, her eyes wide with wonder as the letters took shape beneath her small thumb. One morning, Levi returned from checking his traps with a rabbit so large and fat they all gasped. They roasted it over an open fire, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air filled with the sound of genuine, carefree laughter. That night, watching the flames dance, Ada even let herself smile. She remembered a time, more than 20 years ago, when Jacob had set a freshly baked pie on the windowsill to cool, just because she'd told him she missed the smell of her mother's kitchen. The memory, once a painful ghost, was now a warm comfort. It stayed with her as she watched these children sleep, scattered across her floor like precious jewels, their breaths deep and even. She knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would burn the entire world to the ground before she let another soul take them. But the world didn't wait to be burned. It came back for them, sooner than she expected. 2 weeks later, the dog barked. It wasn't the sharp bark of warning, no growl, no snarling. It was a strange, uncertain sound that made Ada look up from her sewing, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. A horse, not galloping but trotting at a steady, unhurried pace, a single rider. She stepped onto the porch, the shotgun feeling like a natural extension of her arm, and watched as the figure approached. Dusty hat, long coat, saddlebags that looked heavy on both sides. The sun cast him in silhouette, a dark omen against the bright sky, until he drew near enough for her to see the shock of white hair tucked beneath his collar. He was an old man. "Miss Quinn," the man said, tipping his hat. His voice was tired but kind. "Or is it still Mrs. Quinn?" Ada stiffened, her grip on the shotgun tightening. "Who's asking?" He dismounted, his movements slow and careful, his hands always in sight. "My name's Hart, Samuel Hart. I knew your husband, Jacob." Ada lowered the gun an inch, but her eyes remained cold and suspicious. "A lot of men knew Jacob. Not many made it to the funeral." A sad smile touched Hart's lips. "That's because Jacob didn't want a funeral," he said. That stopped her. It was true. Jacob had made her promise. No preacher, no mourning clothes, no gathering. Just her, him, and the earth. How could this stranger know that?
"What do you want?" she asked, her voice laced with distrust. He looked past her, at the boarded-up windows, at the small faces peeking through the cracks. "I came to help," he said simply. "And because those men that came for you, they're not done. They're part of something much bigger and much worse than you can imagine." Ada stared at him, her mind racing. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed, "but you knew my brother." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The preacher who spoke at your wedding. The one who told you that God's will sometimes comes with empty cradles." That night, after long talks and even longer silences, Samuel Hart stayed. The children didn't know what to make of him. Emmy clung to Ada's apron and refused to speak whenever he entered the room. Jack glared at him like a wild pup guarding his den. But Hart didn't press them. He offered stories instead. He sat on the porch, whittling small wooden birds, and told them tales of towns he'd seen burned to the ground, and of the folks he'd seen survive anyway. Slowly, over time, the children softened, and so did Ada. Because Samuel Hart came with more than just stories. He came with maps, names, and a truth so terrible it made the blood run cold. The men who had attacked them weren't just common slavers or outlaws. They were agents, part of a vast, powerful trade ring funded by wealthy, untouchable men, with connections that stretched from one side of the plains to the other. And someone had sent them here with a very specific price on their heads. Not for all the children. For one. "You're saying one of them is worth that much money to them?" Ada asked one night, the lantern light casting long shadows across her tired face. Hart shook his head, his expression grim. He unrolled a piece of parchment across her kitchen table. "I'm not saying one of them is worth something, Ada," he said, his voice low. "I'm saying one of them is someone." He pointed a weathered finger at a name written in elegant script on the parchment. "Does this name sound familiar?" Ada leaned closer, her eyes squinting to read the delicate letters. Elizabeth Margaret Vanrow. She read it slow, then blinked. It meant nothing to her. She looked up at Hart, confused. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep sadness. "That's Elsie's real name," he said softly. "The one she was born with. The one that's carved inside that locket she wears." The locket. The small silver locket that Elsie wore hidden beneath her dress. The one that never left her skin, not even when she bathed. Ada felt her pulse begin to climb, a frantic, panicked bird beating against her ribs. "The Vanrows," Hart continued, his voice barely a whisper, "are one of the oldest, wealthiest families east of the Rockies. Old money, old power, and old dark secrets. That girl, your Elsie, she's the sole heir to all of it, and she disappeared 3 years ago." "She doesn't know," Ada breathed, her mind reeling. "She doesn't need to," Hart replied. "But the men who do know, they're not just looking for a runaway, they're looking to erase a mistake, and they are not giving up." The days that followed blurred into a haze of fear and preparation. Ada told no one what she had learned, but she watched Elsie more closely now, seeing what she had been blind to before. She saw the way the girl never, ever spoke of her parents, the way she flinched at the mere mention of fine carriages or silk dresses, the way her hand would unconsciously go to the locket at her neck whenever she was scared. And then one morning, Hart was gone. Just like that. No note, no goodbye, no sign he had ever been there, except for a trail of hoofprints leading west and a small, perfectly carved wooden bird left on the porch rail. The children searched for him, their voices calling his name until they were hoarse. But he was gone, and with him, Ada's fragile sense of having an ally, of having an edge, had vanished. She knew the wolves were circling again. She could feel it in the air, in the unnatural stillness of the desert. But this time, she understood. They weren't just coming for a group of lost children. They were coming for history. They were coming for blood. They were coming for an heiress named Elizabeth Margaret Vanrow, and the only thing standing between a vast, powerful dynasty and its dark secrets was her. An old woman in a ruined cabin, armed with a shotgun and a promise she'd made to 15 starving children. The moon hung low that night, a swollen, bruised eye veiled in thin cloud. It cast a ghostly light over the sand, so pale and eerie it seemed as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, Ada Quinn sat by the dying fire, her hand wrapped so tight around a mug of cold tea that her knuckles were white. The children were asleep, most of them. She could hear Jack stirring now and then, the boy dreaming loud as always, mumbling things in his sleep he would never dare to say in the daylight. Ruth slept curled like a cat beneath a heavy quilt near the door, a silent sentinel even in her dreams. Peter and Levi lay shoulder to shoulder by the hearth, both too proud to admit they kept watch even while sleeping. But Elsie was awake. She wasn't near the others, and she wasn't near Ada. She was sitting on the stairs that led to the small loft, halfway between the sleeping world below and the dark, unknown space above. She was staring at the silver locket in her hands. It glinted dully in the firelight, its shine worn away by the constant touch of her fingers, but it was still bright enough to catch Ada's eye. "You never take it off," Ada said, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. Elsie didn't startle. She just ran her thumb over the delicate, swirling engravings, scrollwork so finely etched it must have been done by a master jeweler's hand. "I thought if I kept it on," Elsie whispered, her voice so low Ada had to strain to hear it. "Maybe I wouldn't forget, but I can't remember anything worth keeping anyway." Ada rose, setting her mug aside with a soft click. She crossed the room without a sound. Her old knees ached more lately, a dull, persistent pain, but she didn't let it show. She sat on the step below the girl, not close enough to touch, but close enough to be there. "You remember enough," Ada said, her voice full of a conviction that surprised even herself. "More than most would." Elsie finally looked at her, her young eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Do I? You remembered how to help Emmy braid her hair when the little one's hands were shaking too hard. You remembered Jack's favorite game when he was too angry to speak. You remember how to sit quiet when Ruth needs air and how to make Peter laugh without even trying. You remember how to protect them." Elsie blinked, then looked away, her gaze returning to the locket in her hands. "I don't want to be special," she said finally, her voice thick with a sorrow that was far too old for her. "I just want to be here." Ada nodded slowly. "That's the problem with being born into power," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Folks think you owe the world something just for existing." Elsie held the locket tighter, her knuckles turning white. "I think they're coming back." It wasn't a question. Ada didn't lie to her. Yes. The silence that followed wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with decision. A silent, shared resolve passed between the old woman and the young girl on the stairs. That night, Ada didn't even try to sleep. Once the fire had died down to glowing embers and the wind had picked up its mournful song, she went outside. She stood in the cold sand until her feet went numb, her shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. She didn't flinch when a coyote called out, its lonely cry echoing from the distant hills. She didn't blink when the stars flickered through a shifting veil of dust. She just stood there, the small, battered cabin behind her like a fragile heartbeat she was sworn to protect. And then, just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, Hart returned. Only this time, he wasn't alone. 2 riders flanked him, a young man and a young woman, both armed, both moving with the quiet, deadly efficiency of people who had survived more than their faces let on. Their names were short and sharp, Jalen and Rue. They spoke little, ate fast, and seemed to sleep with one eye open. They weren't travelers. They were soldiers. Not for a flag, but for a cause Ada was only just beginning to understand. Hart explained over the kitchen table while the children ate their breakfast in a hushed, nervous silence in the next room. "There's no court that'll save her," he said, nodding toward the wall, knowing Elsie sat just behind it, listening to every word. The Van Roes won't admit she's theirs, not after she's been gone 3 years, not after how she left. She ran, Ada said. She was taken, Hart corrected, his voice grim. Then she ran, from them. No one in her family looked for her. Too many enemies, too many secrets. It was easier to let the world think she was dead. But the men chasing her now, the ones who work for her uncle, they're not just trying to bring her home. Ada's jaw clenched. They want her quiet. Hart's eyes darkened. Exactly. Jalen unrolled another map, this one covering the entire southwest region. It was marked with routes, safe houses, and names scrolled in ink that hadn't been dry for more than a week. They'll come from the east this time, Jalen said, his finger tracing a path through a place called Tallow Ridge. They'll avoid the main roads. It's too exposed. They won't knock this time, Rue added, her voice flat and cold. They'll burn you out. The plan they formed was slow, careful, and terrifying. They weren't going to run. They weren't going to hide. They were going to hold their ground. Ada wouldn't leave. The children wouldn't either. And Hart, despite the years in his bones and the ghosts in his stare, agreed. This was where they would make their stand. They dug trenches. They set up signal flares. They laid traps in a mile-wide perimeter around the cabin. The younger children were moved into the old reinforced goat pen, which now had 2 hidden escape hatches leading into a network of root tunnels. Mabel helped Emmy write goodbye letters, just in case. But then she tore them up the same night, her face a mask of fierce defiance. "If I'm going," she declared, "I'm going with dirt on my hands and not a single word left unsaid." Every evening they trained, every morning they waited, and then, just after dawn on the 6th day, the first shot rang out. It wasn't close. It wasn't aimed at them. It was a message, fired into the air. A single echoing crack that said, "We are here." Ada grabbed her rifle. "Peter, the back! Levi, the loft! Ruth, get the littles to the pen!" Her voice was a thunderclap. "Remember what I told you?" she called after the scrambling children. "Don't cry. Don't call out. Don't move until the sun hits the main gate." The children nodded, their faces pale but determined, and vanished into the tunnel. Rue and Jalen took the flanks. Hart stood on the front porch like it was his own grave, and he'd decided to decorate it with bodies. The next 2 hours were silent. A heavy, suffocating silence that was worse than any noise. Then they came, 7 of them, riding out of the sunrise like demons. All in black coats, all with red scarves covering their faces. No insignias, no names. Ada recognized one of them, the man who had threatened her on her porch, his face still bearing the faint scar Levi had given him. He raised a hand. "You've got something of ours," he called out. Ada didn't reply. "You've got something with our name on it," he screamed. "And we're here to collect." She raised her rifle. "Try." The world exploded in gunfire. The first volley split the air, shattering the wood of the porch railing, sending splinters stinging into Ada's cheek. Hart fired twice, clean and quick. One of the riders dropped from his horse. Jalen moved like a shadow in the upper loft, ducking and rising, hitting targets with a terrifying precision. Ada reloaded, fired, but the attackers didn't retreat. They regrouped, and from behind a ridge, more riders appeared, 5 more this time, fresh and well-armed. "They're flanking!" Rue cursed from the barn roof. "Hold the west line!" Ada shouted to Peter and Levi. Then everything blurred into a nightmare of smoke and fire and blood. The fence caught fire, the flames licking at the dry wood. Ada shot one man clean off his saddle, then ducked as a bullet grazed her shoulder, searing her skin. She saw Hart fall near the porch, bleeding from his side, but still conscious. Ruth, impossibly brave, dragged him back inside the cabin. She heard Peter scream from the barn, a sound of pain, but he was alive. Jalen and Rue were pushing back hard, forcing the attackers to retreat toward the ridge. They were winning. They were actually winning. And then came the scream. It wasn't from the battlefield. It was from underground. It was from the goat pen. Ada's heart dropped into her stomach. She ran, faster than her body should have allowed, faster than thought, and yanked open the hatch to the tunnel. It was empty. At the far end of the tunnel, a new hole had been clawed open from the outside. There was fresh dirt, and 2 sets of footprints in the soft earth. One small and struggling, one large and methodical. Elsie was gone. Ada didn't stop to think. She didn't stop to call for help. She just dove headfirst into the dark, suffocating earth and vanished. The earth closed around her like a tight, damp, suffocating womb. Ada Quinn crawled on her hands and knees, one hand gripping her rifle, the other pulling her body forward through the narrow, collapsed tunnel. Dust filled her lungs, making her gasp and choke, but she kept moving. The walls around her groaned, the old earth shifting under the pressure. The prints were there, just ahead of her, barely visible in the thin, wavering light of the lantern she'd grabbed. One set was small, staggered, Elsie's. The other was deep, methodical, the boot print of a grown man. Elsie had been taken. And this wasn't random. This was a coordinated attack. This was planned. Ada had lived long enough to know when danger was a wild beast, and when it was a man with a map. Whoever dug into that tunnel from the outside hadn't done it on a guess. They'd known exactly where the children were hidden. That meant only one thing: betrayal, or worse, espionage. Someone had been watching them. Someone had waited for the perfect moment of chaos. The tunnel suddenly widened, and Ada emerged into a small cavern, a forgotten shaft cut by old miners decades ago. Rotting timbers drooped from the ceiling like the ribcage of some long-dead giant. Her breath fogged in the cold, damp air. A wet, dark trail on the floor told her the stranger had been dragging his boot. He was injured. She crept low, following the trail until the tunnel finally gave way to the open desert. She emerged behind a tumble of rocks, the rising sun stabbing across the plains like 1,000 blades of light. She squinted, her eyes scanning the ridge. And there they were, 2 figures. One was slumped over a saddle, her small form barely visible. Elsie. Her arms were bound, her face buried in the rider's long coat. The man wasn't riding hard. He moved at a steady, confident pace, as if he wasn't afraid of being chased at all. Ada raised her rifle, took aim, felt the familiar weight of it settle against her shoulder. But she paused. Too far. Too much wind. Too great a risk of hitting the girl. She cursed under her breath, a low, vicious sound, and slipped back behind the rocks. She ran for her mare, which was tethered in the dry brush where she'd left it. The saddle was already packed. She mounted with one smooth, practiced swing and rode low, hugging the curve of the ridge, following them from a distance as they descended into the deep, shadowy canyon. Back at the cabin, smoke still lingered in the air like a bad memory. The firefight had ended in a victory, but it was a victory that had cost them dearly. Peter was bleeding from a deep gash on his leg. Ruth was bruised from her shoulder down to her hip. Jalen had a fresh bullet graze across his ribs. Hart was conscious, but his face was a pale, waxy color, and the bandage across his flank was soaking through with blood faster than anyone liked. "They took her!" Ruth said, her voice choked with fury and grief. "They took Elsie!" Rue pulled her hair back from her face with shaking fingers. "I thought the tunnel was clear. I checked it myself." Peter, his face tight with pain, shoved aside the kitchen table, dragging himself upright with Levi's help. "She would have screamed," he said, his voice raw. "She wouldn't have gone quiet. That means she's alive." "From the bed," Hart rasped. "I saw her. In the man's arms. He didn't hurt her. He just took her." "But why?" Emmy asked from the corner, her voice so small it barely carried across the ruined room. "Why just her?" No one answered, because deep down, they all already knew the terrible answer. Elsie wasn't just any orphan. She was the orphan. The daughter of a disgraced dynasty, a ghost who had once worn silk and diamonds, who now braided straw and carried water without a single complaint. Her blood, her name, meant something to powerful men who valued lineage over life, who valued names over souls. She was a claim, a risk, a weapon. And now, she was gone. Hours passed in the winding canyon. Ada tracked the lone rider until he entered a ramshackle settlement, a border outpost that had long ago fallen off any respectable map. It was the kind of place where coin and cruelty changed hands without any records, a town with no law and no windows with curtains. She tethered her mare outside the livery and entered the town's only saloon, her rifle slung casually over her back, her hat pulled low. Her boots echoed on the dry, dusty floorboards. Inside, 3 grimy men looked up from their cards. None of them smiled. "Seen a man come through?" she said, her voice flat and steady. "Tall, lean, carrying a girl too young to be his daughter." One of the men let out a harsh laugh. "Lady, that describes half the men who come through this town." Ada didn't blink. She walked to the bar, dropped a small leather pouch of silver dust onto the warped wood, and tapped it once with her finger. The laughter stopped. The bartender, a man with a scarred face and one milky eye, looked at the pouch, then at her. He nodded his head toward the back exit. "Livery stable, left 10 minutes ago. Took a wagon headed north." Ada turned and strode out without another word, her steps hard, her grip on her rifle tighter. She knew where north led, to the old ruined Van Row estate, the place no one ever visited unless they had a death wish or blood ties. She followed the wagon tracks, keeping to the trees when she could, cutting across dry riverbeds and deep ravines. Hours turned to dusk, and dusk turned to a starless, moonless dark. Still, she pressed on, fueled by a cold, burning rage. By midnight, she finally spotted it. The manor house, a ruined but still proud silhouette against the night sky. A monument to greed and grandeur, forgotten by time. Lights flickered in a single upper window. That's where she would be. Ada waited. Not out of fear, but out of a predator's patience. She circled the grounds, her movements silent as the wind, and found an old servant's entrance, its door rotted and hanging off its hinges. She slipped into the cellar. Rats skittered away into the darkness. Boards creaked under her weight. She moved like a memory, like a ghost. Each step brought her closer to the faint echo of voices from the room above. "It was never about the girl," a man's voice said. It was a refined, educated voice, but tired and laced with cruelty. "It's what she represents, our name, our loss. You would understand if you ever had daughters." "She's not your property," came Elsie's voice. It was weak, but defiant. "Everything in this house once was?" the man sneered. Ada had reached the top of the narrow servant's stairwell. Through a crack in the door, she saw them. Elsie was bound to a heavy wooden chair, her lip bloodied but her spirit unbroken. A man, gray at the temples, with a long, thin scar across his cheek, paced back and forth like a judge passing sentence. 2 armed guards stood near the fireplace. Ada took one deep, silent breath. Then she kicked the door open. The shotgun blast took the first guard in the leg, dropping him to the floor with a scream before he could even blink. The second guard reached for his weapon, but he was too slow. Ada tackled him, slamming his head hard against the stone doorframe. He went down in a heap. Then she turned to the man with the scar. He held a knife now, not pointed at Ada, but at Elsie's throat. "Let her go," Ada said, her voice a low growl. "She's not yours to save," the man replied, his eyes wild with desperation. "She was never yours to break," Ada shot back. A tense pause, then Elsie spoke, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. "I choose her." The man flinched as if he'd been struck. "She's not your blood," he hissed. "She's my family," Elsie said. He lunged. Ada fired. The knife clattered to the floor. The man stumbled backward, clutching his side, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He wasn't dead. But he was done. Ada cut Elsie free from the ropes and held her for a moment longer than was necessary. Then they ran. They didn't stop running until the dark manor was nothing but a faint shadow on the distant horizon. When they finally rode back into the yard of the cabin, the others were waiting, weary but whole. Peter limped out to meet them. Ruth didn't speak. She just grabbed Elsie and held on, refusing to let go. Even Levi, the stoic soldier, had tears streaming down his face, though he turned away quickly so no one would see. And Ada, she just stood still for a long moment, taking it all in. Then she turned to Hart, who was propped up on the porch. "You still got room in that field of yours out by the sycamore?" she asked. He looked toward the hills where they had buried the other men. For all of them, if need be. The sun rose on a new day. The war wasn't over, the past hadn't died. But in that one perfect moment, with the smoke no longer rising and all her children safe under one roof, it felt like something true and real had finally begun. Family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was fire, sometimes it was choice, and sometimes it was found in the loneliest, most unexpected place in the world. The days that followed were slow, as if time itself had paused to take a breath after so much violence. The children returned to their chores, their laughter still cautious, but returning like the first green shoots of spring after a brutal frost. Ada watched them from the porch most mornings, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she rarely finished. She had a wound in her side that hadn't fully healed, a shallow stab from the man in the manor who'd clawed at her one last time before falling. She kept it wrapped tight and said nothing about the quiet, persistent pain. It was a familiar ache, one that didn't need to be shared. Hart recovered too, but slowly. The bullet had missed anything vital, but it had torn through enough muscle to leave him pale and weak. Ruth helped him stand and walk a little each day. Levi would read to him at night from an old, worn book, though Hart always pretended to fall asleep before the first page was done. He didn't want their thanks. He didn't want their gratitude. He just wanted the house to be full and safe again. But it was Elsie who changed the most, not in the ways Ada had feared. She didn't grow bitter or reckless or haunted by the ghosts of her past. She grew firm. She became stronger in a way that didn't show in her shoulders, but in the steady quiet of her gaze. She no longer flinched when the wind slammed the shutters. She no longer startled when boots crossed the porch too fast. But she never went anywhere alone now, and she always kept a small, sharp knife tucked under her sleeve, hidden in a ribbon she now wore tied around her wrist. She walked every inch of their land in the days that followed, mapping escape routes in her mind, noting where the goats wandered too far, teaching Emmy and Jack how to recognize boot prints that didn't belong to their family. She never said what she was preparing for. She just did it, and Ada let her. One morning, while the children were milking the goats and Hart was sleeping in the loft, Elsie came and sat beside Ada on the porch steps. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and deep. "Why did you stay?" Elsie asked finally, her voice soft. Ada sipped her tea. "Because I knew you'd come back." "No," Elsie said, shaking her head. "I mean all of this. The children, the pain, the work. Why not just leave it all to someone else?" Ada stared out across the vast, empty desert. The sand shimmered in the morning heat, and the distant mountains loomed like quiet, sleeping gods. "Because no one else was coming," she said simply. That night, Ada couldn't sleep. She went to the kitchen and opened the bottom drawer of the old dresser, the one where she kept her late husband's journal. She hadn't touched it in 20 years. The pages were thin and worn, the ink faded. It was full of plans that never came true, of a grand ranch that was supposed to thrive, of children that were never born. She read until the candle on the table burned all the way down. In the morning, she did something strange. She took the journal, walked out to the middle of the yard, and built a small fire. The children gathered and watched in a confused silence. Ada said nothing. She just set the book of broken dreams into the flames and watched it burn, the ashes rising up to join the dust in the wind. "What was that?" Ruth asked quietly. "A beginning," Ada said. Later that week, a man came riding in from the east. He didn't look like a threat, but neither had the last one. Ada met him at the gate, her rifle held loosely, but ready in her hand. He raised both his arms, a friendly smile on his face. "Name's Jude," he said. "I heard some stories. About the kids, about a woman who took in 15 orphans and told the desert to mind its manners. Ada didn't smile back. What do you want? He nodded toward the heavy satchel on his saddle. I'm with a church out of Abilene. We're building something, a school, a home for orphans, for girls who have never had a last name. Ada's eyes narrowed. We don't need handouts. Jude shook his head. It's not a handout, he said. It's a seed. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't run him off either. He stayed for 2 nights, sleeping on the porch. He talked to Ruth about books, played cards with Levi, and read the Bible with Emmy and Mabel. He never asked for anything. He just listened. On the 3rd day, as he was preparing to leave, he asked Ada again, Would you let us help? Ada looked at the children scattered across her yard, chasing goats and climbing trees, trying to stitch together the kind of life they'd never known before. Then, for the first time in a very long time, she nodded. If they wanted to plant a seed, she had the land for it. A year passed. The ranch grew. More children came, runaways, strays, girls that no one else claimed. Not all of them stayed, but many did. Ada, with help from the older children and Jude's church, built more rooms onto the cabin. Hart helped when he could. Peter, it turned out, was a better carpenter than anyone had expected. Ruth became a teacher to the younger ones. Levi and Jack trained the newcomers how to ride, how to shoot, how to listen to the wind and know when something was wrong. And Elsie, she became the gatekeeper. She was the first one to greet any new child who arrived, and the last one to let anyone leave who wasn't ready. She still wore the locket, though she never opened it again. She said the memories inside didn't belong to her anymore. They belonged to a ghost. One evening, Ada found her sitting beneath the sycamore tree where they had buried the 2 men, the tree that stood not far from Jacob's grave. Do you think it'll ever be safe? Elsie asked, her eyes on the distant horizon. Ada sat down beside her, the old wood of the bench creaking under her weight. It's not about being safe, she said. It's about being worth it. Elsie nodded. She understood that now. On the 2-year anniversary of the big fight, they held a service. It was just a quiet one. Hart read from the Psalms. Ruth sang a soft hymn. The children each lit a candle for the people they had lost along the way. No names were spoken, just the flames, a soft, glowing reminder that even in the deepest, darkest night, someone had chosen to stay and hold the line. That night, as the candles burned low and the wind shifted from the east to the west, Ada looked around her porch, where 15 children laughed and fought and loved and healed, and she finally let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the end of her story had never been the lonely cabin in the desert. Maybe it had always been the family that chose her back. The story of Ada Quinn and the children of the desert could have ended there, a quiet, happy ending. But the world is not a quiet place, and the past is never truly dead. It just sleeps. And one day, it always wakes up. 15 years later, the sun still rose over the same desert hills, painting them gold in the morning and rust red by evening. But everything beneath that unforgiving sun had changed. The land where Ada once walked alone, where her threadbare shawl caught the wind like a flag of sorrow, was now a sprawling patchwork of life and purpose. The ranch, now known across 3 counties as Ada's Gate, had doubled in size. What began as one sagging farmhouse and a desperate prayer had grown into a haven. No child left on a doorstep, no widow abandoned, no man crippled by sorrow was ever turned away. The schoolhouse had 3 rooms now, with wooden floors polished smooth by the boots of hundreds of children, and lessons etched in chalk across every wall. The bell still rang every morning, twice on cold days, once on sunny ones. And when it rang, laughter always followed like a promise kept. Ruth, older now, her hair streaked with gray but her spine still straight as steel, stood at the head of the class most days. She was no longer just the teacher. She was the head of the whole place, the one people turned to when rules needed changing, when hearts broke, when the world beyond the ranch walls pushed too hard. And it often did, The world outside hadn't softened. Children still ran from fists and fire, from bad men and worse memories, but they ran toward Ada's gate now, not just away from something, and that made all the difference. Mabel was a nurse. She had studied in El Paso and returned with hands trained to heal and eyes that never blinked at the sight of pain. She set up a small infirmary in the barn's old loft, the same one Hart had once slept in. A plaque, carved by Levi and painted by Elsie, hung on the wall. It read, "The quiet saved me here." Jack had opened a blacksmith shop on the far end of the property. He worked from sunrise to sunset, shaping hinges and horseshoes and tools. He never married and never left, but people said that sometimes, when the wind was just right, you could hear him singing. Elsie ran the town library. Her loud, joyful laugh still echoed through the ranch whenever she visited, and she still argued with Ruth over whether poetry belonged in history lessons. She'd written 2 books. One was about the early days at Ada's gate. The other was about Ada herself. Both were read aloud every spring on the ranch's founding day, with all the children, new and old, gathered beneath the big willow tree. Levi had become a preacher, but not in any traditional sense. He never built a church or wore robes, but on Sundays, people from all around would gather beneath the open sky to hear him speak about faith and family and hope. He spoke with dirt under his fingernails and scripture in his heart. 15 years. And yet, some things hadn't changed. The porch still creaked in the same way. The kitchen still smelled of stew and warm bread. The main gate still swung open, never locked, never closed, and the house still kept one room just for Ada. No one ever slept in it. No one dared. But flowers were always left on the nightstand, and candles were lit. Children who were too young to have ever known her still whispered good night to her door, because they were taught by Ruth and Jack and Elsie that everything they were, everything they had, began with the woman who chose not to turn away. One summer, a letter came from back east. It was from a senator's office, and it carried a proposal to fund a massive expansion. The ranch could become a network, they said, a model, an institution. Ruth read the letter 3 times, her fingers trembling slightly. She gathered the others. They sat around the same kitchen table Ada had once presided over, though now it was longer and wider, surrounded by more chairs than ever before. "They want to take it national," Ruth said, her voice heavy. "They want to send more children, build more homes, train more teachers." Levi nodded slowly. "Sounds like a blessing." "But they want to change the name," Jack said flatly, his voice hard. "They want something modern. Something that doesn't sound like one old woman's porch." The room went quiet. Mabel, standing near the hearth, spoke last. "If we do this," she said, her voice filled with a quiet fire, "we do it our way, her way. The porch stays, the name stays, the gate stays open. They voted. It was unanimous. Ada's gate would remain Ada's gate, and so the ranch did become something larger, a beacon of hope in a dark world. But the core of it never shifted, because every new child who arrived, barefoot and shaking, was still greeted with a bowl of warm stew and a soft blanket. Every child still carved their name into the porch rail. And every spring the bell rang a little louder than the year before. One day, a woman arrived. Her hair was graying, her eyes tired. She was carrying a small boy with a broken arm and leading a little girl who hadn't spoken in weeks. She stood at the gate for a long time, unsure, dusting off her dress, almost turning to leave. Ruth appeared in the doorway. She didn't ask the woman's name. She didn't ask what had happened. She just said the words Ada had once spoken to her so many years ago. "You're home now. Come on in." The gates swung open, and the desert, for a little while longer, became something more than just sand and sky. It became a legacy. A testament to the fact that family isn't about the blood you share, but about the people you're willing to shed blood for. If you were moved by the story of Ada Quinn and the fierce love she built in the middle of nowhere, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have coming up next.